I invested in the Dubai startup, but the founder is misusing company funds. Can I force an audit? Well, it all depends on what type of investor you are. So, and there are, at a high level, there are two types of investors that could happen in a scenario like this. One is an actual formal investor or a shareholder, somebody who has shares recorded or registered to his or her name and as reflected on the license. So these are called registered shareholders or registered investors. And then the other type of investor could be an investor who actually invested into the company, but otherwise does not formally hold shares. They're called purely like financial or beneficial investors. So they have an economic interest in the company, but not a legal ownership of shares. So if you hold shares in the company officially, then your right to force an audit, first of all, determined by the underlying foundational company documents such as articles of association. But generally speaking, if you're a majority shareholder, you have the right to request an audit. And if you're a minority shareholder, you can also request through the courts. So usually the articles of association should kind of determine which investors or which shareholders have what right in terms of, in particular, forcing an audit. But generally speaking, if you're a registered shareholder, you do have a right either directly through requesting the company to appoint an auditor or through the court, but you have a right to so-called force the audit. Now, importantly, the forcing of the auditor, it does not mean that you bring in your own auditor. Basically, what you're doing is that you are forcing the company to perhaps issue a resolution, a board resolution, to appoint an auditor to review the books of the company. So that's if you're a registered investor. Now, in the UAE, often we find people referring themselves as investors or owners of companies, but they actually not registered investors. In fact, instead, they're just economic, so they have an economic interest or the beneficial investors in the company. In other words, legally speaking, there's nothing that ties them officially to the company. So in that case, forcing the company to do an audit is it's a very different exercise. So it's not impossible, but ultimately much will depend on the underlying contractual transaction between the company and you as an investor. So, for example, if you are, presumably, you would have invested the money on the basis of some sort of an agreement. So if in this agreement, there's a provision that allows you as an investor to request an audit of the company under certain circumstances, then if the company refuses to do so, then you could apply to the court relying on this agreement and request for the court to ultimately appoint or give the company mandate to appoint an auditor, or you can even have the request the court to appoint an auditor for the company as in your capacity as a beneficial investor, but on the basis of this agreement. If, however, you do not have an underlying agreement that ultimately gives you that expressed right to an audit, your chances are a lot more difficult. Then it's not to say that you don't have an interest in the company anymore, but requiring an audit, you don't really have standing or legal capacity to do so.